The moment Quincy Vanders realized he had lost everything, his horse, his savings, and his freedom, was the same moment the orc woman across the card table smiled with teeth far too sharp for comfort. "I suppose you will honor the wager," she said, her voice a low rumble that seemed to vibrate through the wooden floorboards of the trading post. Her green fingers, surprisingly dexterous for their size, gathered the cards into a neat stack. The other men at the table had gone silent, their faces ranging from shock to poorly concealed amusement. Quincy stared at his losing hand, still spread before him on the scarred table. 3 sevens. He had been so certain. The pot had grown throughout the evening, and when she had suggested raising the stakes to something more interesting than coin, he had been drunk enough on cheap ale and his own winning streak to agree. Marriage. The word tasted like ash in his mouth now. "I am a man of my word," he heard himself say, though his voice sounded distant to his own ears. His father had been a gambler too, and the one lesson he had drilled into Quincy before drinking himself to death was that a man's word was all he truly owned. The orc woman stood, and Quincy was reminded of just how tall she was. Nearly 7 feet, with shoulders that spoke of years of hard labor. Her dark hair was braided back from her face, revealing the small tusks that jutted from her lower jaw and the pointed ears that twitched slightly as she regarded him. She wore practical traveling clothes, leather breeches, a sturdy tunic, and boots that had seen better days. Around her neck hung a simple pendant that caught the lamplight. "My name is Grashna," she said, extending one large hand toward him. "I will expect you at the shrine tomorrow at noon. Do not be late, Quincy Vanders." He took her hand because refusing would have been an even greater insult, and her grip was firm but not crushing. Her palm was calloused, her skin warm despite the green hue that marked her as other, as dangerous, as something his mother would have wept to see him touching. "How did you know my name?" he asked, though it was a stupid question. This was a small trading post on the frontier, where 3 dirt roads met and travelers stopped to rest before continuing their journeys. Everyone knew everyone's business. "I asked about you before I sat down at this table," Grashna said simply. "I make it a practice to know who I am playing against." The other men at the table began to disperse, suddenly interested in their drinks or the door, or anything that was not the uncomfortable scene unfolding before them. Quincy watched them go and wondered if any of them would have warned him had they known what the orc woman intended. Probably not. Entertainment was scarce on the frontier. "Tomorrow at noon," Grashna repeated, then turned and walked out into the night, leaving Quincy alone with his empty ale cup and the crushing weight of his stupidity. He did not sleep that night. Instead, he lay on the thin mattress in the room he rented above the trading post and stared at the ceiling beams, counting knots in the wood, and trying to understand how his life had gone so completely wrong. He was 23 years old, a veteran of the border skirmishes that flared up every few years between human settlements and orc territories. He had saved his pay, bought a good horse, and planned to ride west to claim some land of his own. Now the horse was gone, sold to cover a debt from 2 months ago. His savings had disappeared into various card games and bad decisions. And tomorrow, he would marry an orc woman who had somehow convinced him to bet his very freedom on a hand of cards. The more he thought about it, the stranger it seemed. Grashna had played well all evening, but not suspiciously well. She had lost several hands, won others, maintained a careful balance that had kept everyone at the table engaged. It was only that final hand where the stakes had shifted, where she had looked at him with those dark eyes and said, "I will wager something more interesting than coin if you are brave enough to match it." And he, fool that he was, had asked what she proposed. "If I win, you marry me," she had said. "If you win, I will give you my horse, my wagon, and everything I own." The other men had laughed, thinking it a joke. Quincy had seen the wagon outside solid construction, a good draft horse, and the kind of traveling supplies that cost real money. It had seemed like excellent odds, especially since he had been winning steadily all evening. He had agreed, shaken on it, and then watched in growing horror as she laid down 4 queens to his 3 sevens. 4 queens. The highest hand possible, given what had already been played. What were the odds? As dawn light began to creep through the shutters, Quincy sat up and put his head in his hands. What were the odds indeed? He had been a soldier, had played cards in barracks and camps across the frontier. He knew how to spot a cheater, or thought he did. But Grashna had been smooth, confident, utterly calm. If she had rigged the deck, she had done it so well that he could not prove it even to himself. The question was why? Why would an orc woman rig a card game to force a human man to marry her? Orcs and humans did not mix, not in that way. There were treaties now, trade agreements, sections of the frontier where both species lived in uneasy proximity. But marriage, that was madness. Humans who took up with orcs were shunned by their communities. Orcs who showed such preference were often cast out by their clans. It made no sense. Unless she needed something from him. Unless this was about more than attraction or whim. Unless he was being used in some scheme he could not yet see. These thoughts churned through his mind as he dressed in his only clean shirt and brushed the dust from his jacket. He had no family to shame, at least. His mother had died when he was 12, his father 3 years later, and he had no siblings. The few friends he had made in the army were scattered across the frontier or dead in those same skirmishes. No one would mourn his poor choice except himself. The morning passed in a blur. He ate breakfast without tasting it, checked his belongings, and realized he owned almost nothing of value. His rifle, his knife, a spare set of clothes, and a few personal items that would fit in a saddlebag. The life of a man who had been preparing to start over, now instead walking toward a future he could not imagine. At 11:30, he walked down the stairs and out into the bright sunshine. The trading post sat at the junction of 3 roads, and the shrine Grashna had mentioned was a small structure on the eastern edge of the settlement. It served all faiths and none, a practical solution for a place where humans, orcs, and even the occasional dwarf or elf might pass through. The priest who maintained it was an old human named Father Derek, who asked few questions and required only that people respect the sacred ground. Quincy walked slowly, aware of eyes watching from windows and doorways. News traveled fast, and by now everyone in the settlement knew about the bet, the cards, and the wedding. He kept his back straight and his face calm, refusing to give them the satisfaction of seeing his shame. The shrine was a simple building of stone and timber with a peaked roof and narrow windows. Father Derek stood outside, his white hair brilliant in the sunshine, his lined face showing neither judgment nor approval. He nodded to Quincy as he approached. "She is inside," the priest said. "Are you certain about this, son? Does it matter?" Quincy asked. "I gave my word." "It always matters," Father Derek said gently. "A marriage entered into under duress is no true marriage in the eyes of the gods." "I was not forced," Quincy said, though the words felt hollow. "I made a wager and lost. That is different from duress." The priest studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Very well. When you are ready, come inside." Quincy took a deep breath and pushed open the door. The interior of the shrine was cool and dim, lit by candles placed in alcoves along the walls. Symbols of various faiths adorned those alcoves: the sun disk of the bright lady, the hammer of the smith god, the the tree of the Green Mother, and others less familiar. At the front of the room, before a simple altar, Grashna waited. She had changed clothes. Instead of traveling leathers, she wore a dress of deep blue fabric that fell to her ankles. It was simply cut but well made, and it fit her strong frame without trying to hide or minimize her orc features. Her hair was still braided, but someone had woven small white flowers into the plaits. She looked both beautiful and terrifying, and Quincy felt his breath catch in his throat. Her dark eyes met his as he walked down the short aisle, and for just a moment he thought he saw something flicker in them. Uncertainty. Guilt. It was gone too quickly to name. "You came," she said, and there was genuine surprise in her voice. "I said I would." He stopped a few feet from her, suddenly uncertain about what came next. "Grashna, before we do this, I need to know why. Why did you rig those cards?" The words were out before he could stop them, and the shrine went utterly silent. Father Derek, who had followed him inside, froze in the doorway. Grashna's expression did not change, but her shoulders stiffened slightly. "You think I cheated?" she asked, her voice carefully neutral. "I know you did," Quincy said, and he was surprised by the certainty in his own voice. "I did not see how, but I know you did." 4 queens against 3 sevens, when the deck had already been running cold all night. After you had been so careful to play evenly until that last hand. You manipulated the game to get what you wanted, and what I want to know is why. For a long moment, Grashna said nothing. Then slowly she reached up and touched the pendant at her throat. It was a simple piece, carved from what looked like bone or horn in the shape of a small bird. "You are right," she said finally, and her voice was very quiet. "I rigged the cards. I switched the deck before that final hand, substituted one I had prepared in advance. You were never meant to win." Quincy felt a strange mixture of vindication and anger. "Why?" Grashna looked away toward the candles flickering in their alcoves. "Because I need a husband, and you seemed like a man who would keep his word. Because I am being forced to marry by my clan, and if I do not choose someone myself, they will choose for me. Because the man they have selected is cruel and stupid, and I would rather marry a stranger I tricked than spend my life with him." The words tumbled out in a rush, each one heavy with emotion. Quincy stared at her, trying to process this new information. "Your clan is forcing you to marry." "I am 30 years old," Grashna said, still not looking at him. "In my clan, that is considered old for a woman to be unwed. My father died 2 years ago, and my brothers now lead our family. They have decided I am an embarrassment and a burden. They have arranged a marriage to strengthen ties with another family, and I have no say in the matter." She finally turned back to face him, and her eyes were bright with unshed tears. "So I left. I took what I could carry, and I came here, and I looked for someone who might be desperate or foolish enough to agree to marry me if the price was right. And you chose me," Quincy said slowly. "A human. I chose you because you have no family to object, because you are a veteran and know how to fight, and because you have a reputation for being honest even when it costs you." Grashna's hands clenched into fists at her sides. "I chose you because I hoped that an honest man, even one I had tricked, might be better than a cruel one I was sold to." Father Derek cleared his throat softly. "Perhaps you two should discuss this privately before we proceed." "No," Grashna said sharply. "He deserves the choice now. I will not force him to honor a rigged bet. Quincy Vanders, you may walk away. I will tell anyone who asks that you fulfilled your obligation, that we married and separated immediately. You will owe me nothing, and your honor will be intact." Quincy really looked at her for the first time. He saw the proud set of her shoulders despite her obvious fear, the way her hands trembled slightly even as she held her head high. the flowers woven into her hair by her own fingers, because she had no one else to help her prepare for this day. He saw a woman who had been desperate enough to cheat at cards and clever enough to get away with it, who had chosen exile from her people over a life without choice. He thought about his own desperation, the empty years since the war, the loneliness that had driven him to spend his evenings at card tables with strangers. He thought about the fact that he had been riding toward an uncertain future anyway, toward land he did not yet own and a life he had not yet built. "No," he said. Grashna's eyes widened. "No, I will not walk away." Quincy took a step closer to her, then another, until he stood directly before the altar. "You tricked me, yes. But you also told me the truth when you did not have to. You gave me a choice when you could have stayed silent, and I understand being desperate enough to do something foolish." He offered her a small, crooked smile. "I bet my freedom on a card game after all. You are truly willing to go through with this?" Grashna asked, and her voice was barely a whisper. "I am willing to try," Quincy said carefully. "I will not promise love or happiness, because I do not know you well enough for that. But I will promise to treat you with respect, to keep my word, and to see where this strange path leads us. If you can promise the same." Grashna blinked, and a single tear escaped to track down her green cheek. "I promise," she said. "I promise all of that and more." Father Derek approached the altar, a small smile on his weathered face. "Well then, shall we begin?" The ceremony was brief and simple. They spoke the traditional vows, holding hands before the altar, while Father Derek blessed their union in the name of several gods and the general goodwill of the universe. Quincy slid a simple iron ring onto Grashna's finger purchased from the trading post that morning with the last of his coin, and she produced a matching one for him that she had clearly prepared in advance. When the priest pronounced them married and suggested they seal the union with a kiss, they stood awkwardly for a moment before Grashna leaned down and pressed her lips briefly to Quincy's. Her tusks made it strange, and her lips were warm and unfamiliar, but it was not unpleasant, just different. Everything about this was different. They signed the marriage record in Father Derek's careful ledger, and then they were walking out of the shrine into the bright afternoon sunshine as husband and wife. A few people had gathered outside, curious onlookers drawn by gossip and scandal, but they dispersed quickly when Grashna fixed them with a hard stare. "I have a camp outside of town," she said as they walked away from the shrine. "My wagon and horse are there. We should collect your belongings and leave this place. There is no reason to stay." "Where will we go?" Quincy asked. Grashna glanced at him, and for the first time he saw uncertainty in her expression. "I do not know. I had not planned beyond the marriage itself. I thought only of escape, not of what came after." "I was planning to go west," Quincy said slowly. "There is unclaimed land past the Broken Ridge territory that is open to settlement under the new treaties. It is rough country, but I am a decent farmer and I know how to build. If you are willing, we could try to start something there." "Unclaimed land," Grashna repeated. "Land where no one knows us, where we would not have to explain ourselves every day." "Exactly." She was quiet for a moment, then nodded. "Yes, we will go west." They collected Quincy's few belongings from his room above the trading post, enduring the stares of the proprietor and his wife, then walked together out of the settlement toward Grashna's camp. It was located in a small grove of trees about half a mile from the main buildings, hidden from casual view by a rise in the land. The wagon was indeed well made, with a canvas cover and sturdy wheels. The draft horse was a large bay mare with kind eyes and a patient temperament. Grashna had clearly prepared carefully for her flight, because the wagon was packed with supplies, tools, seeds, preserved food, blankets, and all the necessities for survival on the frontier. You planned this for a long time, Quincy observed as he helped secure his own meager possessions in the back of the wagon. I have been planning to leave for over a year, Grashna admitted. She was checking the harness, her strong fingers working with practiced ease. But I could not bring myself to do it alone. I'm not afraid of hard work or danger, but the thought of spending my life in isolation, never speaking to another soul, never having anyone to rely on. She trailed off, then shook her head. It seemed worse than staying. So you decided to acquire a husband through deception, Quincy said, and he was surprised to find he was almost amused. Grashna shot him a sharp look, clearly trying to determine if he was mocking her. Yes, I know it was wrong. I know I should have found another way. But I could not think of one, and time was running out. My brothers would have come for me soon. Will they come for you now? Quincy asked, suddenly concerned. Will they try to force you to return? They might, Grashna said slowly, but I am married now to a human. By the laws of both our peoples, that makes me your responsibility, not theirs. They can demand nothing of me. Unless they decide to ignore the law, Quincy pointed out. He had fought enough border skirmishes to know that treaties and laws meant little when honor and family pride were at stake. Then we will deal with that if it happens, Grashna said firmly. For now, we should put distance between ourselves and this place. The more ground we cover before anyone knows which direction we have gone, the better. They set out within the hour, the wagon rolling westward along the dirt road that led deeper into frontier territory. Quincy walked beside the horse for the first few miles, partly to spare the animal and partly because he was not quite ready to sit beside Grashna on the narrow wagon seat. He needed time to think, to process everything that had happened in the space of 24 hours. He had married an orc woman. A woman who had tricked him into it, yes, but who had also been honest when it mattered. A woman who was fleeing her own people to avoid a forced marriage, who had chosen a dangerous path toward freedom rather than accept a life without choice. He found himself respecting that, even as he grappled with the strangeness of his new situation. As the afternoon wore on, the terrain became rougher. The road narrowed to a track, and the settlements grew fewer and farther between. They passed a few other travelers, a merchant with a pack mule, a family of homesteaders with their possessions piled high on a cart, and each time, Quincy felt the weight of stares. A human man and an orc woman traveling together was unusual enough to draw attention, even on the diverse frontier. When the sun began to set, Grashna guided the wagon off the track and into a clearing surrounded by tall pines. They made camp efficiently, working in silence as they unhitched the horse, gathered firewood, and set up a simple cooking area. Quincy noticed that Grashna was skilled with camp work, her movements sure and practiced. She built a fire that caught quickly and burned clean, then produced a pot and ingredients for a simple stew. They ate sitting on opposite sides of the fire, the meal flavored with awkwardness and uncertainty. The stew was good, hearty, and well seasoned, and Quincy found himself grateful for the hot food after the strange day. "Thank you," he said after his second bowl. "You are a good cook." Grashna looked up, surprise flickering across her face. "You do not need to flatter me. We are already married." "I am not flattering you. I am stating a fact." Quincy set down his bowl and met her eyes across the fire. "If we are going to make this work, this partnership, this marriage, whatever we call it, then we need to be honest with each other. I will tell you when you do something well, and I will tell you when you do something that bothers me. I expect the same from you." Grashna studied him for a long moment. "That seems fair. Very well, you walk too fast. When you were beside the wagon this afternoon, you set a pace that had the horse working harder than necessary. If you are going to walk, you need to match the animal's natural speed." Quincy blinked, then laughed despite himself. Point taken. I will go slower tomorrow. Something eased in the air between them, a small thawing of the tension. They talked a bit more as the fire burned down practical things, like how many days it would take to reach the next settlement, what supplies they would need to purchase there, and how best to organize the wagon for the long journey ahead. It was not comfortable conversation, but it was functional, and that seemed like a good start. When it came time to sleep, they faced the question that had been hovering unspoken all day. The wagon had one bedroll laid out in the back among the supplies. They looked at it, then at each other. "I can sleep under the wagon," Quincy offered. "That would be foolish. It will be cold tonight and there are predators in these woods." Grashna's voice was carefully neutral. "We are adults. We can share the space without complicating things further." So they arranged themselves in the wagon bed, lying on their backs with a careful foot of space between them, and stared up at the canvas cover overhead. Quincy was acutely aware of Grashna's breathing, the warmth radiating from her large frame, the scent of pine and wood smoke that clung to her hair. "Quincy," she said into the darkness. "Yes. Thank you for not walking away today. I know I gave you the choice, but I was afraid you would take it. I was afraid I would be alone again." He turned his head to look at her, though he could barely make out her profile in the dim light. "I was alone too. Maybe we can be less alone together." "Maybe," she agreed softly. They fell silent after that, and eventually, exhaustion pulled Quincy down into sleep. The days that followed developed a rhythm. They woke with the dawn, broke camp quickly, and traveled until late afternoon, when they would find a suitable place to stop for the night. Quincy took turns walking and riding on the wagon seat, learning to match the horse's pace as Grashna had instructed. She drove the wagon with confident hands, clearly experienced with both the vehicle and the animal. They talked more as they traveled, sharing bits of their lives in careful increments. Quincy told her about his years in the army, the friends he had lost in the skirmishes, and the way the violence had left him feeling hollow and directionless. Grashna told him about her clan, the traditions that had shaped her life, and the suffocating weight of expectations she had never been able to meet. "I was always too independent," she said on the third day, as they climbed into rougher hill country. "My mother died when I was young, and my father raised me like a son in many ways. He taught me to hunt, to track, to fight. But when he died, my brothers did not know what to do with a sister who could outfight most of the young men in our clan. So they decided to marry me off to someone who would not care about my skills, only about the alliance my marriage would bring." "What was he like?" Quincy asked. "The man they chose for you," Grashna's jaw tightened. "Brutal. He has 3 wives already, all of them subdued and silent. I saw one of them once with bruises on her face. When I objected to the match, my brothers told me I should be grateful anyone would have me at my age." Anger flared in Quincy's chest, hot and sudden. "They should not have treated you that way." "No," Grashna agreed. "But that is the way of things in many clans. Women are valued for their ability to bear children and form alliances, not for their skills or wishes." She glanced at him. "Is it so different among humans?" Quincy thought about the settlements he had known, the families he had observed during his years of travel. "It depends. Some families treat their daughters well, educate them, listen to their wishes. Others see them as property to be managed. I suppose it is the same with any people. Some individuals are good, some are cruel, and most are somewhere in between." "A diplomatic answer," Grashna said with a slight smile. "An honest one," Quincy corrected. They reached a small settlement called Pine Ridge on the 5th day. It was barely a town, just a general store, a smithy, a church, and a scattering of houses, but it was a place to resupply and rest the horse. They drew stairs as they approached, and Quincy felt Grashna tense beside him on the wagon seat. "Let me do the talking," he said quietly. "People will be more willing to trade if they think I am in charge." Grashna's eyes flashed with irritation. "Because I am a woman or because I am an orc?" "Both, probably," Quincy said. "I do not like it either, but we need supplies, and starting a fight over principles will not help us." She was silent for a moment, then nodded stiffly. "Very well, but I will not hide in the wagon like property. I would not ask you to." They stopped at the general store, and Quincy went inside while Grashna tended to the horse. The shopkeeper was a thin man with suspicious eyes and a permanent frown. He looked Quincy up and down, then glanced through the window at Grashna. "That your wife?" he asked. "She is," Quincy said evenly. The shopkeeper shook his head. "Strange times we live in. What do you need?" Quincy purchased flour, salt, dried beans, and a few other staples, paying with some of the coin Grashna had saved from her preparations. The shopkeeper took the money but made no effort to be friendly, and Quincy was grateful to leave the store behind. They moved on from Pine Ridge quickly, neither of them comfortable with the atmosphere. As they traveled deeper into the frontier, the settlements became even more sparse, and the land grew wilder. They saw deer and elk, heard wolves howling in the distance, and once spotted a bear ambling through the trees far from the road. Quincy found himself watching Grashna more as the days passed. He noticed the way she moved, economical and strong, never wasting energy. He noticed how she would sometimes sing quietly to herself in a language he did not understand, her voice low and surprisingly melodic. He noticed the way she cared for the horse, speaking to the animal in soft tones and making sure it was fed and watered before she saw to her own needs. She was, he realized, a good person, honorable in her own way despite the deception that had brought them together. That deception began to feel less like a betrayal and more like a desperate act by someone who had run out of options. On the 10th night of their journey, they camped beside a clear stream in a valley surrounded by forested hills. The weather was growing cooler as they traveled west and gained elevation, and Quincy built a larger fire than usual to ward off the chill. They had roasted a rabbit he had shot earlier in the day, and the meat was tender and satisfying. After they ate, Grashna pulled out a small wooden flute from her pack and began to play. The music was haunting and strange, full of minor keys and unexpected intervals, but it was beautiful. Quincy sat listening, transfixed by the way her fingers moved over the instrument and the focused expression on her face. When she finished the song, she looked up and found him watching her. "My father made this," she said, holding up the flute. "He was not a craftsman, but he tried. It is one of the few things I took with me when I left." "It is lovely," Quincy said. "The music, I mean, and the flute too." Grashna smiled, and it transformed her face. Without the hard edge of anger or fear, she looked younger, more open. "Do you play any instruments?" "No." "I can barely carry a tune," Quincy grinned. "My talents lie in more practical directions." "Such as?" "Well, I am a decent shot with a rifle. I can build a straight fence. I can read and write, which is more than many soldiers can say." He paused, thinking. "And I am told I am a fair hand at mending things. Clothes, tools, whatever needs fixing." "Useful skills for a homesteader," Grashna observed. She set the flute aside carefully. "I can hunt and track. I can preserve meat and tan hides. I am strong enough to help with the heavy work clearing land, building structures. Between us, we might actually manage to survive out here." "We might," Quincy agreed. He hesitated, then asked the question that had been forming in his mind for days. "Grashna, what do you want?" "Not just escape from your clan, but beyond that. What kind of life are you hoping to build?" She looked into the fire, her dark eyes reflecting the flames. "I want land of my own. a home that no one can take from me. I want to wake up each day and know that my choices are my own, that I am not living according to someone else's plan." She glanced at him. "Is that too much to ask?" "No," Quincy said. "That is exactly what I want too." Something shifted between them in that moment, a recognition of shared purpose. They were not just two people thrown together by circumstance anymore. They were partners with a common goal, and that mattered. That night, when they lay down to sleep in the wagon, the space between them was smaller than it had been before. Not touching, but close enough that Quincy could feel the warmth of her arm near his. It felt companionable rather than awkward, and he drifted off to sleep with a sense of unexpected contentment. The next morning, everything changed. They were breaking camp, loading the wagon and preparing to continue west, when Grashna suddenly went very still. Her head turned, her ears twitching as she listened to something Quincy could not hear. "Get the rifle," she said quietly. "Someone is coming." Quincy grabbed his rifle from the wagon and checked that it was loaded. His heart rate kicked up, and he felt the old soldier's alertness snap into place. "How many?" "At least 3, moving fast through the trees to the north." Grashna was scanning the forest, her body tense. "They are not trying to be quiet." A moment later, Quincy heard it too, the sound of heavy footsteps crashing through the undergrowth, coming closer. Then 3 orc men burst into the clearing, and Quincy's first thought was that they were massive. Even larger than Grashna, with muscles that spoke of lives spent in combat and labor. The lead orc had a scar that ran from his forehead down across one eye, and his expression was thunderous. "Grashna," he snarled, "you will come home, now." "I will not, Korg." Grashna stepped forward, placing herself between Quincy and her brothers. "I am married now. You have no claim on me, married to a human." The scarred orc Korg spat the words like a curse. "You have shamed our family, shamed our clan. This false marriage will be annulled and you will fulfill your obligations." "There is nothing false about it," Grashna said, her voice steady despite the danger. "We were married by a priest, witnessed and recorded. It is legal by the laws of both our peoples." One of the other orcs, slightly smaller than Korg but no less intimidating, stepped forward. "You think hiding behind a human will save you? You think we will allow this insult to stand?" Quincy raised his rifle, aiming it at the speaker. "You will not touch her," he said, keeping his voice calm. "She is my wife, as she said. If you attempt to take her by force, I will defend her." All 3 orcs turned to look at him, and Quincy felt the weight of their contempt. To them, he was weak, small, barely worth noticing. The 3rd orc actually laughed. "The human threatens us, Korg. What shall we do?" Korg's hand moved to the axe at his belt. "We will take our sister home, and if the human interferes, we will bury him here." Quincy's finger tightened on the trigger, but before he could fire, Grashna moved. She lunged forward and slammed into Korg, driving him back with her shoulder. The two of them grappled, and Quincy was reminded that Grashna was not helpless. She was a trained fighter, strong and fast, but she was also outnumbered. The other 2 orcs moved to help their brother, and Quincy had to make a split-second decision. He could fire and potentially kill one of them, which would make him a murderer and likely provoke a blood feud that would follow them forever. Or he could try something else. He fired the rifle into the air. The sharp crack of the gunshot made everyone freeze. Into the sudden silence, Quincy's voice rang out clear and hard. "This is not how you want this to end. Think about what you are doing." Korg had Grashna by the arm, but he paused, his eyes on the rifle that Quincy was now aiming directly at him. "You would kill your wife's kin. I would protect my wife from anyone who tried to harm her, kin or not." Quincy kept the rifle steady. "Grashna is an adult. She made her choice. You may not like it, but it is done. You can accept that and leave in peace, or you can force a fight that will end badly for all of us." "He is right, Korg." Grashna wrenched her arm free and stepped back toward Quincy. "I left because you gave me no choice. You tried to sell me to a brute, and you would not listen when I objected. So I took control of my own life. If you ever respected me, if you ever cared about me as your sister and not just as a piece in your political games, then you will accept this and go." The scarred orc stared at her, his expression a mixture of anger and something that might have been pain. "You were always difficult," he said finally. "Even when we were children. Father spoiled you, let you run wild, and now look what it has brought us to." "Father taught me to value myself," Grashna shot back. "That is not the same as being spoiled. I am sorry that my choices have embarrassed you, but I am not sorry I made them." For a long, tense moment, no one moved. Then Korg turned and spat on the ground. "You are no sister of mine. You have chosen the humans over your own people. When you need help, when you are suffering and alone, do not come to us." "I will not," Grashna said softly. The three orcs turned and walked away, disappearing back into the forest as suddenly as they had appeared. Quincy kept his rifle raised until he could no longer hear their footsteps, then finally lowered it with shaking hands. "Are you all right?" he asked Grashna. She was standing very straight, her face carefully composed, but he could see the way her hands trembled. "I am fine." "That went better than I expected, actually. I thought they would try harder to take me. You knew they would come. I hoped they would not, but I knew it was possible." Grashna looked at him, and her eyes were bright with unshed tears. "Thank you for standing with me. You could have let them take me. It would have solved the problem of our marriage, freed you from an obligation you never truly wanted." Quincy set down the rifle and crossed the distance between them in 3 steps. Before he could think better of it, he pulled Grashna into a hug. She was tall enough that his face pressed against her shoulder, and she was solid and warm in his arms. "You are my wife," he said into her tunic. "I meant the vows I spoke. I will not let anyone harm you." For a moment, Grashna stood frozen. Then her arms came up and wrapped around him, and she held him with surprising gentleness for someone so strong. They stood like that for a long minute, drawing comfort from each other's presence. When they finally pulled apart, Grashna wiped at her eyes quickly. "We should go. They may come back with others, or they may try to follow us. The farther we can get from here, the better." They finished breaking camp in record time and set off westward at a faster pace than before. The encounter with Grashna's brothers had shaken them both, but it had also clarified something important. This marriage was real now, in a way it had not quite been before. They had stood together against external threat, had chosen each other over easier paths. As the days passed and they traveled deeper into the western frontier, Quincy found himself thinking of Grashna less as the orc woman who had tricked him and more as simply Grashna. His wife. His partner. She was clever and competent, with a dry sense of humor that emerged more often as she relaxed in his presence. She could read the weather from the shape of clouds, could find edible plants where Quincy saw only weeds, and could outwork him at any physical task. But she also had vulnerabilities. She flinched at loud noises sometimes, a remnant of old training or old fears. She was uncomfortable in settlements, always aware of the stares and whispers that followed them. And at night, when she thought he was sleeping, he sometimes heard her crying quietly. He never mentioned it, sensing that she would be embarrassed. Instead, he tried to be more attentive during the day, to make sure she knew she was valued and safe. They crossed the broken ridge on the 18th day of their journey, following a narrow pass between towering peaks. The land beyond was rougher than what they had left, but it was also achingly beautiful. Wide valleys stretched between pine-covered mountains, clear streams cut through meadows of tall grass, and the air was clean and crisp. According to the maps Quincy had studied before leaving the trading post, this was free territory land open to settlement by anyone brave or foolish enough to try. It was also dangerous, far from any military outpost or established settlement, but that isolation was part of its appeal. They spent 3 days exploring before they found the place that felt right. It was a valley nestled between two ridges, with a stream running through it and a natural clearing that would be perfect for crops. There were trees for timber, flat ground for building, and a sense of shelter without being closed in. This could work, Quincy said, surveying the land with a growing sense of excitement. We could build a cabin here near the stream, clear land for fields there and there. Use that stand of timber for lumber. Grashna was walking the perimeter of the clearing, her experienced eyes assessing the terrain. The soil is good. The stream will not flood in spring, I think. See how the banks are formed. And there are game trails through those trees. We will not lack for meat. Then this is it, Quincy asked. This is where we make our home. Grashna looked at him across the clearing, and she smiled, a real, genuine smile that lit up her whole face. Yes, this is home. They made camp that night in the clearing that would become their homestead, and the mood was lighter than it had been since they met. They talked late into the night, making plans for the cabin, for the fields, for the life they would build together. It felt less like a partnership of convenience and more like a genuine collaboration, two people working toward a shared dream. When they finally lay down to sleep, Grashna reached out in the darkness and took Quincy's hand. "I am glad it was you," she said softly. "I am glad I cheated at cards to marry you." Quincy squeezed her hand gently. "I am glad you did too." The next weeks were consumed by hard work. They began by felling trees, cutting them into manageable lengths and dragging them to the building site Quincy had marked out. Grashna's strength was invaluable for this work. She could lift logs that Quincy could barely budge, and she worked with tireless efficiency. Together, they laid a foundation of stone gathered from the stream bed, then began constructing the walls of their cabin. It was rough work, and they made mistakes, walls that were not quite square, joints that did not fit as tightly as they should, but slowly. The structure took shape. They lived out of the wagon during this time, falling into bed each night exhausted and sore. But there was satisfaction in the work, in seeing tangible progress each day. The cabin grew from a floor to walls to a roof, and with each addition, it became more real. Quincy found himself watching Grashna as they worked. He noticed the way the sunlight caught the green of her skin, making it almost luminous. He noticed the grace in her movements despite her size, the competence in her hands as she worked. He noticed the way she laughed when something went wrong, a deep, rich sound that made him want to smile. He realized with some surprise, becoming attracted to her. Not just respecting her or appreciating her skills, but actually desiring her. It was a strange feeling, given how their relationship had started, but it grew stronger with each passing day. One evening, as they sat by the fire after a long day of work on the roof, Grashna caught him staring. "What?" she asked, touching her face self-consciously. "Do I have dirt on my cheek?" "No," Quincy said quickly. "I was just thinking that you are beautiful." Grashna froze, her eyes going wide. "What? You are beautiful," Quincy repeated, feeling his face heat but determined to be honest. "I know you probably do not think of yourself that way, and I know our marriage started as a transaction, but somewhere along the way that changed for me. I find myself thinking about you when we are apart. I look forward to the sound of your voice, and I think you are beautiful, your strength, your determination, everything about you." For a long moment, Grashna did not respond. Then she stood and walked away from the fire, her back to him. Quincy felt his heart sink, certain he had overstepped, had made things awkward when they were finally working well together. "Grashna, I am sorry. I should not have. No one has ever called me beautiful before," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "In my clan, I was too large, too muscular, too aggressive. Men looked at me and saw a warrior, not a woman. I have spent my whole life being told I should be smaller, quieter, more pleasant." She turned to face him, and there were tears on her cheeks. "And then you say that I am beautiful, and you mean it. I can hear it in your voice." Quincy stood and crossed to her, taking her hands in his. They were so much larger than his, calloused and strong, and he loved them. "I mean it, and anyone who could not see your beauty was a fool." Grashna let out a shaky laugh. "You are good with words for a soldier." "I am good at telling the truth," Quincy corrected. "Grashna, I know this marriage started as a trick, as a way for you to escape, but it has become more than that, at least for me. I want this to be real. I want us to be real." She looked down at him, and he saw hope and fear warring in her expression. "I am afraid," she admitted. "I am afraid to want this, to believe it could be real. What if you change your mind? What if you wake up one day and regret being tied to an orc?" "I will not," Quincy said firmly. "I know myself well enough to know that. When I commit to something, I commit fully, and I am committed to you, to us, to this life we are building." He paused, then added more softly, "I am falling in love with you, Grashna. I think I have been for a while now." Her breath caught, and fresh tears spilled down her cheeks. "I love you too," she whispered. "I think I started loving you that day at the shrine, when you figured out I had cheated but married me anyway, when you gave me choice instead of judgment." Quincy reached up and gently wiped the tears from her face. "Then let us choose each other, fully and completely, not because of a bet or a trick, but because we want to." Grashna leaned down, and this time when they kissed, it was different. It was tender and hungry at once, full of all the emotion they had been holding back. Her tusks no longer felt strange against his mouth, they were simply part of her, part of the woman he loved. They kissed until they were breathless, until the fire had burned down to embers, and then Grashna took his hand and led him to the wagon. They made love that night, learning the landscape of each other's bodies with wonder and care. Grashna was gentle despite her strength, always careful of her size and power. Quincy tried to show her with touch and whispered words that he cherished every part of her, that her differences were not flaws but aspects of her beauty. Afterward, they lay tangled together in the narrow space, and Quincy had never felt more content. This was what he had been searching for without knowing it, not just land or purpose, but partnership, love, home. "We should marry again," he said drowsily. "Properly this time, without tricks or obligations, just two people choosing each other." Grashna laughed, the sound rumbling through her chest. "We are already married, Quincy. I know, but I want to do it right. I want to look you in the eyes and speak vows that mean everything, with no shadow of deception between us." She was quiet for a moment, then nodded against his shoulder. "Yes, I would like that. When the cabin is finished, when we have built this place into something real, we will have our own ceremony. Just the two of us, promising ourselves to each other." "It is a deal," Quincy said and kissed the top of her head. The cabin was completed 3 weeks later, just as the first serious cold of autumn arrived. It was not large, just one room with a loft for sleeping, a stone fireplace and shuttered windows, but it was solid and snug. They had built a small barn for the horse and wagon, and had begun clearing land for next spring's planting. The day they moved their belongings into the cabin felt monumental. They arranged their few possessions, hung Grashna's father's flute on the wall, and made up the bed in the loft with all their blankets. That night, they cooked their first meal in the fireplace and ate sitting on the floor, too happy to care about furniture they did not yet have. "Tomorrow, we marry again," Quincy said as they cleaned up after the meal. Tomorrow, Grashna agreed. The next morning dawned clear and cold with frost sparkling on the grass. They dressed in their best clothes, which were not much, but they were clean, and walked together to a spot by the stream that had become a favorite place. The water burbled over smooth stones, and the trees overhead were brilliant with autumn colors. They had no priest, no witnesses, no official ceremony. But Quincy spoke from his heart, looking into Grashna's eyes as he promised to love her, to stand with her, to build a life with her. And Grashna, her voice steady and sure, promised the same. They exchanged the rings they had worn since the first ceremony, but this time the gesture felt different. It felt like a promise freely given, not an obligation fulfilled. When they kissed, sealing their vows, Quincy felt a sense of rightness settle deep in his bones. This was his wife. This was his home. This was the life he had been meant to find. They returned to the cabin hand in hand, and spent the rest of the day working on the smaller projects that would make the place more comfortable. Quincy built a table and benches from rough lumber, while Grashna constructed shelves for storage. They worked in companionable silence, occasionally catching each other's eye and smiling. As winter approached, they settled into the rhythms of frontier life. They hunted and preserved meat, gathered the last of the wild edibles before snow covered everything, and prepared the cabin for the cold months ahead. They also began to make contact with the few other homesteaders in the region, a family about 5 miles to the north, a solitary trapper 10 miles to the south. These neighbors were wary at first, unsure what to make of a human-orc couple, but Quincy and Grashna were friendly and helpful, and gradually they were accepted. The first snow came in late autumn, and Quincy stood at the cabin door watching the flakes fall and thinking about how much his life had changed. 3 months ago, he had been a directionless veteran gambling away his future. Now he had a wife he loved, land of his own, and purpose. All because an orc woman had cheated at cards. "What are you smiling about?" Grashna asked, coming to stand beside him. She wrapped an arm around his shoulders and he leaned into her warmth. "I was thinking about that night at the trading post," Quincy said. "About how angry I was when I realized what you had done. And now I am grateful. You gave me a gift, even though neither of us knew it at the time. You gave me a chance at a real life." Grashna kissed his temple. "We gave each other that chance. I could not have done this alone, and neither could you. We needed each other." "We still do," Quincy said, "and we always will." The winter was long and harsh, but the cabin held against the cold and their supplies lasted. They spent the dark months maintaining their equipment, planning for spring, and simply being together. They talked for hours by the fire, learning more about each other with each passing day. Grashna taught Quincy words in her language, and he taught her the songs his mother had sung to him as a child. They played games with carved pieces, cooked elaborate meals when they had the ingredients, and made love with increasing confidence and joy. It was during one of these long winter nights that Grashna told him she was pregnant. Quincy stared at her, his mind struggling to process the words. "Pregnant? Are you certain?" "I am certain," Grashna said, and there was both joy and fear in her voice. "I have missed my courses for 2 months, and I have been sick in the mornings. I have felt this before. I have sisters who have borne children. I know the signs." "We are going to have a child," Quincy said wonderingly. He placed his hand on her stomach, which was still flat, but beneath which a new life was growing. "Our child." "Are you happy?" Grashna asked anxiously. "I know we did not plan this, that it is happening very fast." "I am happy," Quincy interrupted. "I am terrified and unprepared and completely happy. We are going to have a baby, Grashna. How could I be anything but overjoyed?" She relaxed against him, relief evident in every line of her body. Good. I am terrified too, but I am also more excited than I have ever been. We are going to be a family. We already are a family, Quincy said. This just makes it more official. They spent the rest of the winter preparing for the baby's arrival. Quincy built a cradle from carefully chosen wood, sanding it smooth and carving simple designs into the sides. Grashna sewed blankets and small clothes, using fabric from the supplies she had brought and supplementing it with soft animal hides she tanned herself. They talked about names, about how they would raise a half-orc child in a world that might not accept them, about all the hopes and fears that came with impending parenthood. Spring arrived eventually, melting the snow and revealing the land they had claimed. They planted their fields with the seeds Grashna had saved, working long hours to get everything in the ground at the right time. The physical labor was harder for Grashna now that she was pregnant, and Quincy insisted she rest more often than she wanted to. "I am not fragile," she protested one afternoon when he suggested she take a break. "I know you are not," Quincy said patiently, "but you are carrying our child and I will not risk either of you by pushing too hard. Please, Grashna, let me take care of you." She grumbled but agreed, and Quincy noticed she was secretly relieved. The pregnancy was taking a toll, even on someone as strong as her. In late spring, they had visitors. The family from the north, the Johnsons, a husband and wife with 3 young children, came to call, bringing fresh bread and news from the wider world. They sat around the table Quincy had built, drinking tea and talking about weather and crops and the simple matters of frontier life. It was Mrs. Johnson who noticed Grashna's condition. "Oh, my dear, you are expecting," she exclaimed. "How wonderful! When are you due?" "Late summer, we think," Grashna said, looking pleased by the older woman's enthusiasm. "If you need any help, any advice, you send word," Mrs. Johnson said firmly. Childbirth is not easy, especially the first time, and it is good to have experienced women nearby. Quincy felt a wave of gratitude toward this kind woman who looked past species and circumstance to offer support. "Thank you. We appreciate that more than you know." The Johnsons left with promises to visit again, and Quincy felt a little less isolated. They were part of a community now, however small and scattered. They had neighbors who cared, and that mattered. The crops grew through the summer, and so did Grashna's belly. By midsummer, she was obviously pregnant, moving with the careful balance of someone carrying extra weight. Quincy found her even more beautiful like this, glowing with health and purpose. They harvested vegetables from their garden, traded with the trapper for pelts, and continued to improve their homestead. Quincy built a proper bed frame to replace their makeshift sleeping arrangements, and Grashna dug a root cellar to store their winter supplies. They worked together seamlessly now, each anticipating the other's needs and movements. In late summer, on a hot afternoon when the air hung heavy and still, Grashna's labor began. Quincy was in the field when he heard her call his name, and he ran back to the cabin faster than he had ever run before. He found her inside, gripping the edge of the table, her face tight with pain. "It is time," she said. "The baby is coming." Quincy's mind went blank with panic for just a moment, then his soldier's training kicked in. He had seen injuries and crises before, had learned to stay calm and focused when others needed him. He could do this. "I am going to ride to the Johnsons and get Mrs. Johnson," he said. "You should lie down, try to rest. There is no time," Grashna said through gritted teeth. "The pains are close together. You will have to help me." "I do not know how to deliver a baby," Quincy said, fear creeping into his voice. "You will learn," Grashna said, and despite the pain, there was a hint of her usual wry humor. "Come, help me to the bed. We will figure this out together." The next hours were the longest and most terrifying of Quincy's life. Grashna labored with the same fierce determination she brought to everything else, but childbirth was brutal in ways he had not imagined. He did what she told him to do, brought water and clean cloths, held her hand when the contractions came, and tried not to let his fear show. Just when he thought he could not bear watching her suffer any longer, the baby was born, a slippery, squalling bundle that Quincy caught in trembling hands. He placed the infant on Grashna's chest, and they both stared down in wonder. Their daughter was perfect. She had her mother's green skin and pointed ears, but her features were softer, more human. Her eyes, when they opened, were Quincy's brown. She had tiny tusks just beginning to emerge and a shock of dark hair. "Hello, little one," Grashna whispered, tears streaming down her face. "Welcome to the world." Quincy cleaned the baby gently while Grashna rested, then wrapped her in the softest blanket they had made. He placed their daughter back in Grashna's arms and sat beside them on the bed, overcome with emotion. "She is beautiful," he said, "just like her mother." "She has your eyes," Grashna said, touching the baby's tiny hand. "What should we name her?" They had discussed names all through the pregnancy but had never settled on one. Now, looking at his daughter, Quincy thought of his own mother who had loved him despite his father's failures, who had worked herself to exhaustion to keep them fed. "Elara," he said, "after my mother. If that is acceptable to you." "Elara," Grashna repeated, testing the name. "Yes. Elara is perfect." They sat together like that for a long time, just the three of them, while the afternoon light faded to evening. Quincy felt a profound sense of completion, as if every wrong turn and misstep in his life had been leading him to this moment, this place, this family. The weeks after Elara's birth were exhausting but joyful. The baby was healthy and strong, with a lusty cry that woke them several times each night. Grashna recovered quickly, her orc constitution serving her well, and soon she was back to light work around the homestead. Mrs. Johnson came to visit as soon as she heard the news, bringing gifts and advice and cooing over the baby with genuine delight. "She is absolutely precious," she declared. "You two must be so proud." "We are," Quincy said, and he could not stop smiling. As summer turned to autumn and then winter again, their little family found its rhythm. Elara grew quickly, hitting milestones that amazed and delighted her parents. She smiled at 6 weeks, laughed at 3 months, and by 6 months was sitting up and reaching for everything within her grasp. The homestead prospered too. Their first harvest was modest but sufficient, and they had laid in good stores for the winter. They had made friends with several other families in the region, and had become known as reliable neighbors who would help in times of need. One evening in late autumn, when Elara was 8 months old and already trying to pull herself up on furniture, Quincy and Grashna sat by the fire after putting the baby to bed. They were tired. They were always tired these days, but it was a good kind of exhaustion, the kind that came from meaningful work and full lives. "Do you ever regret it?" Quincy asked suddenly. "Leaving your clan, rigging those cards, marrying me?" Grashna looked at him with surprise. "No, never." "Why would you ask that?" "Because it cost you so much," Quincy said. "You lost your family, your people, everything you knew. Sometimes I worry that I have not given you enough in return, that you would have been happier if you had found another way." Grashna set down the shirt she was mending and moved to sit beside him. She took his face in her hands and looked into his eyes with fierce intensity. "Listen to me, Quincy Vanders. You have given me everything that matters. You have given me freedom, love, partnership, and a child I adore. You have given me a home where I am valued for who I am, not judged for what I am not. I would rig those cards 1,000 times over if it meant ending up here with you." "I love you," Quincy said, his voice thick with emotion. "I love you so much it scares me sometimes." I love you too, Grashna said, and kissed him softly. Now stop worrying about things that do not matter and come help me finish this mending. Your daughter grows faster than I can let out her clothes. Quincy laughed and went to help. And as he worked beside his wife in the warm cabin with their daughter sleeping peacefully in the next room, he thought about how strange and wonderful life was. A rigged card game had brought him to this place, to this woman, to this life he could never have imagined. He was grateful for every moment of it. The winter passed peacefully, and spring arrived with the promise of new beginnings. They planted their second season of crops, expanded the barn, and began planning additions to the cabin. Alara took her first steps just after her first birthday, toddling from Grashna's arms to Quincy's with a delighted laugh. More settlers arrived in the region that spring and summer, drawn by reports of good land and relative peace between humans and orcs. Some of them were surprised to find a mixed couple, but most accepted it with the pragmatism of frontier people who cared more about capability than convention. Quincy and Grashna became known as leaders in the small community that was forming. They helped new arrivals get established, mediated disputes, and shared their knowledge freely. Their homestead became a gathering place, and their cabin saw frequent visitors. On a warm summer evening, 2 years after that fateful card game, Quincy and Grashna sat on the porch they had added to the cabin, watching Alara play in the yard. The little girl was chasing butterflies, her green skin bright in the golden light, her laughter ringing through the air. I have been thinking, Grashna said. We should start a school. There are enough families now with children who need education, and I can read and do mathematics. You can teach history and practical skills. We could hold classes here, a few times a week. Quincy considered this, then nodded slowly. That is a good idea. Children need more than just survival skills. They need knowledge, culture, a sense of connection to the wider world. And I want Alara to grow up knowing she is not alone, Grashna added. That there are other children, human and orc and mixed, who are all just trying to find their place in this world. Then we will start a school, Quincy agreed. We will build something good here, something that lasts. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching their daughter and the land they had claimed. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink, and the air was full of the sounds of summer insects chirping, birds calling, the distant sound of the stream. Quincy. Grashna said softly, Yes, thank you for seeing past what I did, for giving me us a chance. Thank you for building this life with me. Quincy took her hand, his fingers intertwining with hers. Thank you for rigging those cards. Thank you for being brave enough to choose your own path, and for letting me walk it with you. Grashna laughed, the sound rich and full. We make a good team, you and I. The best, Quincy agreed. As darkness fell and they called Alara inside for supper, Quincy reflected on the journey that had brought them here. It had started with deception, yes, but it had led to something real and true and lasting. They had built a home, raised a child, and created a life full of love and purpose. And it had all begun because an orc woman had rigged a deck of cards and a human man had chosen to honor his word. Sometimes, Quincy thought as he closed the cabin door behind them, the best things in life came from the most unexpected places. Sometimes a mistake or a deception could lead to something beautiful. Sometimes losing a bet was the best thing that could ever happen. He looked at his wife and daughter, at the warm cabin filled with their belongings and their love, and he smiled. Yes, he was grateful for that rigged card game. He was grateful for every moment that had followed. This was home. This was family. This was love, and he would not change a single thing.